I want to welcome you all to the third annual Hemispheric Security Conference. It is now my honor to introduce my boss, the founding dean of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, Dean John Stack.
Welcome everybody to RFIU. I am just thrilled to be here today to spend some time with you at the conference. Today we will discuss some of the most pressing security issues affecting the hemisphere, and I would argue the world. From recent changes in U.S. security policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean to the crisis in Venezuela and the impact of external and non-state actors on the region. Miami is important because if there's a sneeze in Latin America, we get a cold here. It's been that way for a long, long time, so that it's really important that we're having this meeting with such a distinguished group of experts. So what does the security environment look like in 2018, and what can we do to create a more peaceful and prosperous world? I want to thank all of you for being here. Before we begin, I want to recognize the wonderful work of Dr. Franco Moore, the director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, and my own, as a student, Brian Fonseca, the director of the Jack D. Gordon, yes, Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy. Along with their teams, these two individuals have done a tremendous job organizing and thinking through the implications of the conference. Your tireless work is appreciated and evident by the crowd and participants that are here. Let's hear it again for Frank and Brian. And of course, thank you so much to the U.S. Army War College for partnering once again with the Green School. We are always honored to collaborate with such a prestigious institution, such an important institution for the national security of the United States, and we hope to continue this partnership for years to come. I also want to thank all of our guest speakers. They are tremendous. Some of the top leaders in the hemispheric security are here with us. Thank you, Juan Cruz, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs, for being here. Thanks to Pete Marocco, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and Senior Bureau Official for the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization of Operations at the U.S. State Department. And thank you to the 4 former Deputy Assistant Secretaries of Defense for the Hemisphere: Roger Pardo, Murray, Stephen Johnson, Rebecca Chavez, and the Green School's own Frank Moore. So let me turn it over to Frank Moore at this point. Welcome to FIU. Get out and see the campus and come back soon. Go ahead.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? It's so good to see so many friends and colleagues, and thank you all for being here. You know, Brian and I and our staffs put a lot of work, but it's the willingness of all of you to attend and to be part of this discussion that we'll have today with some of the senior folks in government and former government officials and the academic community. It's great to see you all here. My job now is to introduce someone who I've known since our days in Paraguay, when she was ambassador to Paraguay. Of course, everyone knows Liliana Ayalde. She is currently the Civilian Deputy Commander and Foreign Policy Advisor at U.S. Southern Command and since January of 2017. As you all know, she has been a Foreign Service officer now since 1982, where she's held a number of key positions In addition to being our ambassador in Brazil, our ambassador to Paraguay, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, where she covered Central America, the Caribbean, and Cuba. Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean Bureau at the USAID. And a number of other postings, not only in the Western Hemisphere, but in Bangladesh and elsewhere. She is, I think, one of the not only a career ambassador or someone who, as I said, many of you know, but just a delightful person to work with and someone who I've known, as I said, for a number of years. And I'm just so grateful to her, not just for coming and speaking to you today, but for the collaboration that she continues to do and have with us here at FIU from her post at Southern Command. So Liliana, Ambassador Ayalde, please come up. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ayalde.
Good morning, Dean Stack, Brian. Thank you, Frank, for that warm welcome. And so many colleagues and friends. It's really a wonderful opportunity to see so many of you again. This is certainly a very distinguished audience, and I'm sure that it's going to pull together some very interesting conversations, and it'll help improve our understanding of security challenges in the hemisphere. So it's going to benefit us all as we hear all these different panelists and speakers provide their views and their perspectives on security. For those of you who don't know what that long title that Frank mentioned, Senior Foreign Policy Advisor and Civilian Deputy Commander at U.S. Southern Command is, it's really a mouthful. What it is I'm the State Department's representative to the part of the U.S. military that focuses on Latin America and the Caribbean. That's Southcom. The role I play has given me the unique opportunity to view the region's security challenges through the nexus of development, diplomacy, and defense, the 3Ds. Since I originally started my Foreign Service career in USAID, then rolled into State Department, and currently I am in the military culture. It reconfirms to me that security concerns are interconnected and that these threats require not only a whole of government approach, but a whole of society. Southcom is a joint military command with about 1,200 active duty reservists and civilians stationed at our headquarters here in Doral. Our job is to look south, to focus on building security partnerships with nations in the Americas. For more than 50 years now, we've worked with partners within the US government, the interagency, and militaries across the region on issues like illicit trafficking, responding to natural disasters, and migration crisis. In almost every instance, the U.S. military plays a supporting role in Latin America, helping advance our foreign policy objectives through defense engagements and training regional militaries in crisis response, human rights, and drug interdiction. We have seen the need to shift our focus to a network approach in tackling security threats in the region. We know that criminal and terrorist networks thrive in institutional vacuums, flourish where justice is weak, and the legitimate state is challenged to remain effective. So the focus is not so much as, on the commodities, such as the drugs, the arms, etc., but rather the enabling factors that allow these illicit networks to thrive. Our audience today, I'm sure, is quite familiar with Latin America and is keenly interested in its future. That's why we're all gathered here today, to learn from each other, exchange ideas, and better understand the changing dynamics in the region. The core issues we're going to examine are ones of enormous interest to U.S. Southern Command, the State Department, and numerous other federal agencies. The first panel is going to examine issues of change and continuity. From Southcom's perspective, we'd add one more C, connections. We see an increasing alignment on economic policy, security concerns, and a common condemnation on the erosion of democracy on Venezuela. For the most part, Latin America is a good news story, even a great news story. The region is at peace, democracy is flourishing, economies are slowly recovering from a global crisis, human rights in general are protected. Latin American nations are like-minded, natural partners for the United States. We share the same values and many of the same interests. Politically, we've seen a decline of the leftist populist leaders who espouse anti-American sentiment. ALBA is increasingly irrelevant. Defense-wise, the region is characterized by capable, professional militaries, some on par with NATO countries, who contribute to UN missions around the world and export their security expertise, such as Colombia to Central America. In general, they are eager to work with us to advance our shared values and shared goals. And there's a simple reason for that: connections. Because of geographic proximity and economic, social, and other linkages, a security challenge that affects one nation in this hemisphere affects us all. We've seen the devastating effects of hurricanes, drug trafficking, gang violence, and political and economic crisis, and even public health epidemics such as Zika. These issues may start in places like Brazil, Haiti, El Salvador, and Venezuela, but they don't stay there. They ripple across countries throughout the region. We feel the effects in our community almost immediately. In addition to these growing connections, we're also seeing growing complexity and increasing change in the security environment, where once we worried about drugs, now we worry about criminal networks with global reach. Along illicit superhighways that span the globe, criminal and terrorist networks are moving people and products like cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, weapons, and gold. They're using containerized shipping and free trade zones to move illicit products and conduct trade-based money laundering, and they're making money. The global illicit market is worth an estimated $2 trillion in illegal goods and services. Cocaine alone generates an estimated $650 billion in annual global profits. And that's just one product. Dirty money generated in the region flows through the global financial system, distorting our economies, eroding the rule of law, and impacting the profits of legitimate businesses. But this dirty money does something else far more insidious. It helps both criminal and terrorist organizations finance and expand their operations, creating insecurity and instability across the globe, and right here at home. Latin America is also prone to natural disasters and humanitarian crisis. Though a humanitarian crisis may not touch us directly, our connections, personal, physical, political, and commercial, mean we are impacted directly and almost immediately. Just look at Haiti or in the situation in Venezuela. At Southcom, we also worry about the global challenges of China and Russia. What once seemed like a problem over there, China competing for influence or Russia spreading fake news stories about the United States, very much takes place over here. Connections, change, complexity, it's all happening right here. The U.S. military plays a supporting role in addressing all these issues. We're helping our law enforcement and regional partners counter illicit networks that are destabilizing key partners and undermining democratic and financial institutions. We also work with other civilian agencies to prepare for and respond to natural disasters, like we did during last year's devastating hurricane season in the Caribbean with Irma and Maria. And finally, we're deepening our security relationships, working with regional militaries on issues related to human rights, international peacekeeping, drug interdiction, and humanitarian response. This engagement encourages them to do more with us and each other to confront shared challenges to our collective security and to advance our shared interests and values. While the U.S. government has a very crowded national security agenda, I think there's a lot of positive energy and attention being focused on the Western Hemisphere, which is why I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker who can shed some light on some of these challenges and opportunities in the region. Mr. Juan Cruz is the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere Affairs on the National Security Council. He has a long and distinguished career serving in Latin America and the Caribbean and has terrific insights into the regional dynamics and the administration's priorities and policies for our hemisphere security. So with that, I'd like to pass on the floor to Juan, please. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to thank the university administration and the program directors here, and especially my friend Frank Mora for inviting me to speak to you today. When he reached out to me a few months ago and invited me to assume one of the keynote speaker positions, I eagerly agreed. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Then I saw the list of participants and panel members and such, and I thought, is it too late to pull out? All I ask is that you be kind as I share with you some perspectives from the administration, and we'll follow it up with some questions and answers. Anyway, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you about Latin America, a topic near and dear to my heart. During the 30-plus years that I've been working in the region, the extent of the progress has been profound. If we all think back to the mid-'80s, too many of the countries in our hemisphere were governed by right-wing military dictatorships, and we've come a long way. The region still must confront major challenges, however, and including the underlying threats of corruption and economic instability. And some of these are manifested most in the places where there is the greatest threat to democracy: Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. We stand at a crossroads, however. We have an opportunity to reassert U.S. leadership in the Western Hemisphere, and we're buoyed by elections of forward-leaning, market-driven governments. We're inspired by the drive of a new generation of leaders who come from places as different as Kingston and Buenos Aires, but who share our common values of prosperity, democracy, and freedom. We hope this movement continues. The 8 countries who will be holding elections, who have held or will be holding elections 2018, will help determine the future in the Western Hemisphere. While many countries in our region progress, a few isolated countries continue to cling to failed ideologies. They move backwards or remain stagnant. It is a time to expose repressive governments, and especially those who oppress, torture, and murder their citizens. They do not belong in today's Western Hemisphere, in a modern hemisphere. This administration opposes repressive governments and ideologies, especially those in our own neighborhood. The United States will be confident, active agents of progress. The national security strategy guides our actions, as does the acknowledgement that we owe it to all Western Hemisphere citizens to build on the bold steps taken by past leaders. The United States is methodically addressing these security challenges. We are confronting repressive regimes, providing humanitarian assistance, securing our borders, enforcing our laws, and removing dangerous drug dealers and violent criminals from the streets of our hemisphere. And to do this, we're strengthening our partnerships with nations across the region. I recently accompanied Vice President Pence as member of the U.S. delegation to the Summit of the Americas, where we celebrated the hemisphere's advancements, how far we have come. Although unthinkable even a decade ago, at this year's summit, nations came together to focus on democratic governance against corruption. Participants understand that corruption is a pervasive issue that corrodes the foundation of democracy, undermines trust in our governments, and empowers criminals. It robs a nation of its very spirit, strangles out freedom, and causes prosperity to wither. Recent scandals show corruption is a common challenge throughout the region. With disregard for national boundaries, we can and should acknowledge the progress we have made in the hemisphere, but we still have a long way to go. Corruption underlies and exacerbates almost every major security challenge the region faces, whether it is oppressive governments, the increased influence of external actors, the ease of illicit trafficking of all nature, and unfair economic practices or politically rigged systems. As the summit highlighted, democratic governance is one way to combat corruption. At its core, this includes maintaining the rule of law, condemning those who are against it, conducting free and fair elections, and protecting the individual rights of citizens. The Vice President challenged those who believe in a democratic hemisphere to be bold and uphold these values, not only when it is easy, but more importantly, when it is difficult. This brings me to Venezuela and Cuba, the greatest democratic challenges in the region, a list that Nicaragua is too eager to join. Collectively, the world has allowed the corruption and repression in these countries to flourish at the cost of their sovereignty, their national treasures, and their citizens' blood. That is changing with this administration. Consequences of the Maduro regime's policies extend well beyond Venezuela's border, threatening regional stability and security. Venezuela stands in stark contrast to the growing prosperity and standards of living seen in a growing number of our region's countries. In flagrant violation of the Bolivarian Constitution, Venezuela is not irrevocably free and independent. It does not value freedom, equality, justice, or international peace. It operates contrary to the doctrines of Simón Bolívar. Madman Maduro's regime turned a flourishing democracy into a repressive dictatorship. By any metric, the Maduro regime has failed to uphold its constitutional duties to protect citizens and respect their dignity and the democratic exercise of the will of the people, to build a just and peace-loving society, and to further the prosperity and the welfare of its own people. Failed policies have pushed the Venezuelan economy to near collapse, resulting in a humanitarian disaster. Venezuela was once one of the richest countries in the Americas, but now cannot even feed its own people or provide essential medicines once taken for granted, whether they be the treatment of malaria, measles, prophylaxis, or even antibiotics. What I'd like to offer you is a quote from a grand figure from our hemisphere, words uttered by Mario Vargas Llosa scant 2 weeks ago when he was visiting Colombia. I think very apropos, and like most things, best said in their native language. So with your permission, I'll read this in Spanish. Venezuela es un país que se está extinguiendo. Se está desapareciendo por la incompetencia, la torpeza, el sectarismo y también la pillería. The Maduro contagion imperils the stability of the region, forcing its neighbors and others to deal with the spillover of the failing state marked by the largest cross-border mass exodus in our hemisphere's history. At least 5,000 Venezuelans flee the land of their birth daily. This is imposing severe costs on all of its neighbors. Almost 2 million Venezuelans have left since 2014, straining resources, exacerbating security concerns and humanitarian needs, and increasing public health concerns throughout the region. As a good neighbor, the United States refuses to stand idly by and watch our fellow citizens of these Americas endure these abuses and deprivation. We will continue to seek avenues to deliver humanitarian aid to help save the people of Venezuela. We have just gotten started, though. We still continue to act until the Maduro regime follows its own constitution, holds free and fair elections, releases all its political prisoners, and stops repressing the Venezuelan people. We have already issued 2 executive orders on Venezuela, sanctioned over 50 current or former senior Venezuelan officials, and cut off the petro from the U.S.'s financial markets. We have also provided over $16 million of direct aid to the region to help meet the needs of the vulnerable, displaced Venezuelans. We act because it is the right thing to do, not because it's easy. Our policies are founded in compassion. However, fortunately, we don't have to act alone. Regional partners in numerous other countries have taken individual and collective actions. Just a week ago, 16 Latin American and European nations announced they will work together to locate and seize assets of corrupt Venezuelan government insiders who have siphoned off funding that could have gone to alleviate the hunger in Venezuela. Canada has sanctioned more than 40 Venezuelan officials. Panama followed suit, designated more than 50 Venezuelan officials as high risk for money laundering. Argentina and Brazil, among many others, have helped suspend Venezuela from places such as Mercosur. And let's not forget that Peru withdrew Venezuela's invitation to the summit, a smack in the face. But I'd like to make a call out to Venezuelan citizens. Title III, Article 134 of the Bolivarian Constitution reads, quote, "Everyone, in accordance with the law, has the duty to perform such civilian or military service as may be necessary for the defense, preservation, and development of the country, or to deal with situations involving a public calamity," end quote. We call on every citizen to fulfill their duties outlined in this Constitution and urge the military to respect the oath they took to perform their functions. Honor your oath. The Constitution reads for the military that the military, quote, "is at the exclusive service of the nation and in no case at the service of any person or political partisanship," end quote. Enforcing the current trajectory of Maduro's policies is certainly not in the best interest of Venezuela or the people. Let me turn to Cuba. Cuba also remains fully committed to repressing its people who just yearn for freedom. The transition charade that we all witnessed on April 19th did not fool any serious observer or follower of Cuba or those who think that Cuba was somehow turning a new page. Raul Castro may have passed the presidency to his handpicked successor, but he and his ilk remain in charge of the Communist Party and decision-making for that country, as Miguel Díaz-Canel acknowledged during his introductory speech as president. And of course, after taking power, Díaz-Canel followed in the footsteps of his predecessors by welcoming Venezuela's Maduro to Cuba as his first act as president. Need we say more? The administration will seek to promote a stable, prosperous, and free country for the Cuban people. To that end, our Cuba policy channels funds away from the regime and towards the Cuban people. It ensures funding does not go to companies or institutions that directly support Cuban military, security, or intelligence services. It also presses for the expansion of internet services, free press, free enterprise, free association, and ensures all limited engagements between our governments serve to benefit the United States or the Cuban people. We will continue to pressure the Cuban regime to improve its human rights record, end repression, and improve the lives of the Cuban people. Enter Nicaragua. Nicaragua seems intent to join Cuba and Venezuela in casting aside all democratic norms. Through a series of questionable elections, thuggish repression, attacks on civil society, independent media, and peaceful protesters, the Ortega regime has proven that it does not respect democratic values that we share in the hemisphere. Ortega's unbridled reliance on Venezuela and Cuba and his increasing cooperation with Russia demonstrates the subservient role Nicaragua plays to the region's malign actors. Ortega must cease his attempts to undermine democracy in Nicaragua and allow his people the freedom of expression and assembly guaranteed by that country's constitution. If Ortega continues following the examples of the region's maligned actors, the United States will not idly stand by, just like we will not ignore any other collective threats to the hemisphere. While Venezuela and Cuba represent a large threat in the hemisphere, a host of other underlying security threats affect regional stability and security. Many threats are highly visible and commonly acknowledged, whether it is immigration, crime, transnational criminal organizations, or a threat of Russian and Chinese malicious interference in the region. However, I would like to take a moment and focus on security threats like the ones economic stability and health issues. These are sometimes overlooked by the public or even by experts, but this administration feels are integral to peace and stability. Economic strength is key to a country's ability to prevent security issues or address other problems that may arise. It is in everyone's interest to ensure Latin American countries are economically stable and prosperous. It is in everyone's interest to keep jobs and opportunities in our region. Thus, prosperity, security, and good governance are critical pieces of our hemispheric security. The United States supports investment in global developments to advance economic prosperity and global stability, and believes women are key drivers to achieving both. We recently unveiled the 2X Women's Initiative, where the U.S. will directly invest $350 million in all sorts of projects, including $150 million to projects that support women entrepreneurs in Latin America. The administration affirms that societies that truly support and empower women in the workforce are more successful, stable, and prosperous. The administration recognizes that fair and reciprocal trade are also essential to a robust economic partnership with our neighbors. The U.S. is working with several Latin American countries to help develop and fulfill their energy and infrastructure needs. In February, the Department of Treasury unveiled América Crece, America's Growth. It's an initiative that creates action plans to execute commercial opportunities, identify barriers to U.S. firms, and put forth strategies to overcome those barriers for each country involved. We have already engaged Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Panama, and Colombia on potential agreements. América Crece also increases transparency and helps combat corruption and supports efforts to address economic and security challenges. Now a few words on health and health security. Health crises tie not only to a nation's economic stability and prosperity, but to the region's security. While health crises can come in many forms, I will highlight two examples of concern in our Latin America: drug use and infectious diseases. With historic drug cultivation and production in the region, drugs represents both a security and a health issue. We all know this. But outside the U.S., traffickers now are more commonly paying locals in product rather than cash, leading to increased drug usage in countries in the region and placing a new stress on our societies and increasing domestic health costs. While the drug problem is a man-made issue, the region also faces potential natural security disasters. Every few years, the world encounters new infectious diseases that rapidly jump national boundaries. You probably remember the Zika outbreak that infected individuals in numerous Western Hemisphere countries a few years ago. Although the public may often overlook this as a security issue, the current administration does not. Our national security strategy specifically prioritizes detecting and containing biothreats at their source, supporting biomedical innovation and improving medical response. Addressing health threats on a cooperative regional basis allows all parties to increase detection, prevention, and response to emerging outbreaks. As demonstrated with Zika, when leadership from the US CDC in partnership with the Brazilian Ministry of Health defined and addressed the crisis with the world watching in the run-up of the 2016 Olympics, a productive collaboration in our hemisphere which produced incalculable global benefits. Beyond the loss of life and potential weakened ability to secure nations, the economic burden of health crisis can be tremendous. We're still doing the numbers, but Zika may end up costing Latin America and the Caribbean $18 billion in losses where we can afford it least, in those small tourist-dependent economies. Now, in closing, the Trump administration is closely monitoring all the security challenges which will be mentioned here today. While the administration has been busy over the last year, work has only begun. Now is the time to do more, much more, and all options are on the table. In the Western Hemisphere, we have a remarkable opportunity to build our shared history, culture, and perspective. We all live in the same neighborhood. We succeed when our neighbors succeed. We struggle when our neighbors struggle. We will continue to deepen our security relationship with countries across the region in the years ahead. We will strengthen our collective security by confronting those who threaten our noble people and our very way of life. We will zealously protect the time-honored values that unite us. And we will stand together to reject all those who discard freedom and democracy. And if you permit me, I'd like to close with a few words. I make a call to Venezuelan civil servants, public servants, security officials, and military personnel. Perhaps those who have made a bad decision or who have had a lapse of judgment. Now is an opportunity to restore your self-dignity, to restore the dignity in your institutions, and to restore the dignity in your nation, and to restore democracy in Venezuela. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Juan. I know you have a very busy schedule. It's great to have you here, if only for a short time. So we're going to, and Juan has agreed to take a few questions. And so I think, if memory serves me, we're going to have a mic here pretty soon. There's the mic. So if you want to ask Juan a question, line up. I have a quick question, Juan, and before, as our folks get lined up, I want to make sure I understand what you said. So is the position of the administration, as you indicated in your remarks, that la salida, the way out of Venezuela, is a military coup? And if the answer is yes, what makes you think that that's the option that would restore democracy?
Well, I don't know if I actually said that or implied it. But if you look at the history of Venezuela, there's never been a seminal moment in Venezuela's history and politics that did not involve the military. And so it would be naive for us to think that a solution to Venezuela would in some fashion include a very strong nod, in the minimum, a strong nod from the military, a whisper in the ear, a coaxing or a nudging, or something a lot stronger than that. We don't necessarily advocate, but I would say we don't dismiss, precisely because of the military's role. For us, I think we outlined exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for simply the government to abide by its own constitution, release political prisoners, restore rights, and restore the semblance, more than just a semblance of democracy, even if I can call it that, and more importantly, free, fair, verifiable elections. Let's just level the playing field. And I think that in Venezuela, if you really want to look at it, I would propose that the solution in Venezuela is more likely to be a multilateral solution that involves some sort of negotiations, a transitional government with a number of people around the table that perhaps will make us feel uncomfortable, individuals that we would rather see punished than as part of the solution. But I think the world experiences that for the peace to come to Venezuela, we'll all have to bite our lips a little bit and watch a solution that is that has to have some form of forgiveness.
Okay, great. Well, yes, please identify yourself and then ask a question.
Good morning, David Adams. I'm a reporter with Univision. Thanks very much for giving us a rare opportunity to hear from you. We know you've maintained most of your career very quietly. And so it's fascinating to hear your thoughts now in your public role. Frank rather stole my question, but I'll follow up on it a little bit. Can you explain a little bit more what you were saying about the article of the Constitution that you felt that Venezuelan military and government officials ought to be thinking about? And what exactly did you mean by that? What kind of actions should they be taking, besides Frank's question regarding a military coup, particularly public officials? I know some of them obviously are facing US sanctions. And just on the question of Nicaragua, has Daniel Ortega crossed a line? I lived in Nicaragua in the 1980s. I watched Nicaraguans jump on buses and come to the United States, fleeing Ortega's rule then. Are you worried that that might happen again, that Nicaraguans, if a solution isn't found quickly, will be emigrating like some of their Central American colleagues?
So there are at least two questions there. On the issue of the Constitution, I was referring to two parts of the Bolivarian Constitution. One of them makes a call to its citizenry to do the right thing, to always protect the nation under any circumstance, whether it be a natural calamity or a man-made one, and there's a call in that. and that's, I refer you to the Constitution. And there's a second article in the Constitution that's quite clear that indicates, this is the one that refers to the military in particular, and it says that the military has an obligation to the nation that goes beyond any political party, any ideology, and any individual. And all we're asking is that they respect their own Constitution and remember the oath that they took. This is quite clear. It's not open to interpretation. The language is quite clear on this. And so if you're asking to stop behavior, the behavior is, if you're practicing partisan politics, you're not abiding by your oath or the Constitution. It's quite that simple. On the issue of Daniel and Nicaragua and has he crossed the line, I think that that's precisely the issue. He has to be careful not to cross the line. And as far as any migratory response, I don't have a clue.
Let's take 2 questions. Identify yourself and please be brief, please.
My name is Beatriz Rangel. I am a consultant. Sir, I was involved many months ago in the preparations of the first Summit of the Americas. And at that point in time, everybody was very proud to say that there was only one single dictatorship in the hemisphere. Now we say there are 2, perhaps 3, perhaps 4. Is that progress?
Next question, please.
Very much. My name is Desiree Gonzalez. I'm with FIU's Model United Nation program. And I just would like to pick Mr. Cruz's brain on something. Given that, although we know that the transition of power did not really speculate any actual regime change, do you feel that the next generation of politicians coming into, let's say, the Cuban government will somehow foreshadow a change in U.S. relations towards Cuba? Or will it remain strictly the same given the continuity in actual communist policies?
Pretty good question from the student, huh? Okay.
So on the first question on the summit and such, yeah, I think there has been progress in that we can stand up straight and be very clear. With the exception, Venezuela and Cuba are 2 very different cases for a place like the summit. It hurts me to say it, but we can get critical mass on Venezuela, but we have often struggled to get that on Cuba. And that's more in the conscience of other countries than it is on us. But that's precisely why most of what I dedicated today was on these countries, because that's what we should be working on. And if not, we'd be talking about some other issue. I'd probably be focusing on counter-narcotics or counter transnational organizations or something like that. And as for any opportunities with the new Cuban government to change the tenor of the relations, I'll be honest, I find it hard to believe. One thing I didn't mention today, but that's at the top of our list, is these health attacks on U.S. diplomats and Canadian diplomats. That's something that is unacceptable. It's something that the Cubans have mocked and dismissed, and typical of individuals who don't value the individual rights of people. And I don't see that while that continues that we could have any sort of building of bridges or restoring of any sort of relations. They need to practice better behavior before we can engage in any substantive talks.
Thank you. Please.
Mr. Cruz, I would like to come back to the original question. Luis Fleischman, Center for Security Policy, that Frank actually raised. If you are speculating about the possibility of a military coup, what we are seeing, we are observing in Venezuela is that the military is still pretty much loyal to the government. In Chile, let's say 40 years ago, with much less chaos in Chile, the military intervened. Here, doesn't seem likely. Are you doing anything to encourage dissidents within the military in Venezuela?
Let's take, because we're running out of time, 2 more questions here that are lined up. We
Yes.
may have more.
My name is Mark Mooney. I'm a adjunct professor at the Jack Gordon Institute. Many would argue that it's a regional coalition that's needed because of the complexities in Venezuela, perhaps Nicaragua as well. What is the outlook for a sustained regional effort, a coalition of sorts to, to apply diplomacy and a multifaceted
Can I ask you to
approach.
repeat the question? And we can't hear you up here, so if...
I'm sorry. The question concerns a regional approach to Venezuela and other Latin American problems, Nicaragua. What are the prospects for a coalition of regional nations, and what is their ability to sustain some pressure, multifaceted, economic, medical, what have you, to influence and perhaps change the course in Venezuela, perhaps Nicaragua, and other challenges?
Okay. You got the first question, right? Okay.
Good morning. Thank you for being here today. My name is Michael Scadden. I spend a lot of time with the Jack Gordon Institute and the Latin American Caribbean Center around here at FIU. I guess my question would be if you could discuss a little more about the 2X women's initiatives that you mentioned, and specifically, what's the implementation of that look like, and what are the long-term expectations given those initiatives? Thank you.
Juan?
All excellent questions. On the speculation regarding a military coup and the comments made about loyalty, and I'm going to differ a little bit with that assessment in that just you will have noted, if you follow developments in Venezuela, that a scant 2 months ago, there was a large-scale arrest of lieutenant colonels and colonels who, if you believe the press, were all doing precisely that, coup plotting. So that doesn't sound to me as an institution that has guaranteed its loyalty to the president. And certainly not when you look at where those officers came from and what units they represented. Also, the question involved, are we encouraging the military, Venezuelan military in any way? I'm going to answer that question in a broader sense. If you look at one of the tools that we've utilized that has had the greatest impact, and it's the one regarding sanctions, individual sanctions and sectoral sanctions. If the object of sanctions, we often look at them as punitive, but the primary purpose of a sanction is to modify or shift or change behavior, to dissuade others from the practices that these individuals conducted, or to take individuals who are being sanctioned and dissuade them and have them correct their behavior. In this, if you're the military and you look at who's being sanctioned for bad behavior, that should, if you're a Venezuelan military officer, you should look at that as an example of what happens to those who collaborate, rob and steal, and participate actively in a kleptocracy. And if you look at those who have had good behavior, you'll see that they haven't been sanctioned. And so hopefully that is a way to influence, at least psychologically, and show some examples of what can happen to you if you misbehave. As far as a regional approach and the prospects for that, I would go back to sanctions only to indicate we've never had the level of cooperation in this region on something like this. The fact that countries can come together and create a critical mass, as is Lima Group on their own, without U.S. leadership and without even U.S. representation, that they can make their own decisions to punish and to provide right and left parameters for Venezuela to follow or to violate, says a lot about the region and the maturity and where their head is on this. I applaud any and all efforts, and we'll take any help we can. This is a hemispheric problem, and the hemisphere is responding. That also goes a little bit to what I mentioned during my speech on the finance minister's decision. That's a decision taken out taken by a group that hasn't come together on the issue of Venezuela. It just felt morally responsible to do so. And one comment on the 2X Women's Initiative, it's pretty that the objective is to put money where it can be best invested and where we haven't done anything in the past. It's a program that's in close partnership with OPIC. So what I direct you to is go to the OPIC site. OPIC is not an entity that's usually associated with excitement, but this is an exciting program. So if you look up OPIC, and you'll see some introductory language, and of course Ivanka is heavily invested in this, and if you had the opportunity to hear her during the summit describe the program, I think you'd be more than impressed.
we run out of time, but Juan, once again, I want to thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to join us. I think this may have been one of the few opportunities the administration's had to give some remarks on U.S. policy towards the region, and we're just honored that you're able to do here at FIU. Please join me in thanking Juan Cruz.